Welcome back, everybody, to another fantastic episode of the Pokemon Adventures Podcast, a short from the Every Pokemon Episode Ever podcast, everybody, that I do with my good old pal, Dougie Fresh. And this is Chapter 13, titled Sigh For Psyduck. And what I like to do at the beginning of every single one of these podcasts is give you a small recap as to what happened in last week's episode. So here we go. So Red is getting ready to race in a Pokemon triathlon, basically. And Red slowly finds out that in this race, you have to use your Pokemon too to try to gain a little bit of an advantage within this race. But when he gets to a forest, he meets up with a bug catcher, and the bug catcher basically tells Red, hey, I wouldn't go through this forest if you don't have any bug spray, because if you don't have bug spray, you're going to get hurt. Hard-headed Red, just like Ash in the Pokemon series, is like, I don't need no bug spray. So he proceeds to go through the forest, has Bulbasaur cutting down all sorts of leaves and vines and stuff just to get splatted on the head by cutting down a bee drill beehive. And at that point, Red ends up getting stung all over the face, all over the body, all over the top of his head. And he continues to race, though, so he can win this prize, and he meets up with Bug Catcher and the swimmer, where a Snorlax is sleeping. And we find out the only way to wake up Snorlax is with food. So Bulbasaur still had honey on its head, so Red offers up Bulbasaur and to Snorlax and is like, don't you want this honey on Bulbasaur's head? And then we cut to a frame where Snorlax is literally chasing Red to the finish line. Red wins, but it takes all 10,000 Pokédollars in order to feed Snorlax and keep him contained. So Red won the race for nothing. And that is where we left off. And now it is time for Chapter 13, Sigh For Psyduck, everybody. So we start this, and it says that we start this adventure up north in Lavender Town. And people who know what Lavender Town is, you kind of can guess what's about to happen. But it's pouring rain, and Red does not know how to put his Pokemon away. And Red's basically like, if I'm going to get rained on, my Pokemon are going to get rained on too, because he has Poliwrath running, he has Bulbasaur running, and Pikachu is not liking this rain at all. And Red's like, we've got to find a place to get out of this rain. And he's walking up to people that have umbrellas. He's like, excuse me. And then in the next frame, the person sees Red, and the guy's like, whatever. And Red's like, let's try that again. Excuse me. And he runs up behind the guy again, and the guy just ignores him again. He's like, geez, is this Lavender Town or leave them their town? And then all of a sudden he hears behind him, not very trusting people, are they? And Red's like, ah! And he looks behind him, and it's Mr. Fuji, everybody. Mr. Fuji. And Red's like, how did he sneak up on me like that? And he's like, mind if I ask what you're doing, sir? And Mr. Fuji's like, just paying my respects, as it seems like he's at a gravesite because there's a tombstone. And the old man goes, he lived to a ripe old age, my beloved Pokemon, but his time came at last. And then we get a close-up of the tombstone, and we find out that it was a Doduo. And it says, Doduo, rest in peace. And Red's like, oh. And Mr. Fuji is like, thank you. Because Red gets down and starts praying right next to him. And Mr. Fuji's like, are you also fond of Pokemon? And Mr. Fuji gets up. He's like, come, have something warm to drink at my house. So Mr. Fuji invites him over to his house, and then we go to the next title, and it says the home of Mr. Fuji. And from here, Mr. Fuji is pouring Red some tea as Red is trying to kind of dry up from the rain. He's like, for many years, this town was said to be a gathering place for the souls of Pokemon. And then he looks out the window at the famous Pokemon Tower. He's like, to honor the souls and give them a place of rest. The townspeople erected a great Pokemon Tower. And Red's like, you mean that building is a Pokemon cemetery? And we get a close-up of the Pokemon Tower. And Mr. Fuji is like, indeed. And Red's like, but if that's the cemetery, why didn't you build your memorial there? Mr. Fuji's like, because no one dares venture near the tower. Whenever we risk it, they appear. Red's like, they? And we get a drawing of a stereotypical ghost. And Miss Fuji is like, the ghost. And Red's like, ghost? He's like, ghost, he says. Pokemon Ghost. And Mr. Fuji is like, you saw the fear in the townspeople's eyes for yourself. They've become so terrified of the ghost that they have forgotten how to trust one another. And in the next frame, you just see a whole bunch of trainers just ignoring each other and just being just mean and scowling at each other. Mr. Fuji continues, and he's like, they won't even make eye contact with staring strangers. And Red's like, but you may choose to believe. Oh no, Mr. Fuji is like, but you may choose to believe or not. And Red looks over at a picture. He's like, is that your Doduo? And Mr. Fuji goes, it was. If only I can let my Pokemon rest in a proper place instead of a weed-grown alley. And Red continues, and he's like, you must have cared a lot for your Doduo, as he's flipping through all the photos and the memories. And then he gets to one photo, and he's like, Blue? And it's a picture of Blue, Doduo, and Mr. Fuji. And Mr. Fuji's like, you know that, lad? And Red's like, I'm on a quest to fill this Pokédex with information on every Pokemon there is. And my rival on that quest is Blue. And Mr. Fuji is like, he passed through town just before I lost my Doduo. And Red's like, where is he now? And then Mr. Fuji is like, just like you. When I told him about the ghost, he laughed it off. And Red sits there and he just swallows his spit. He's like, gulp. And Mr. Fuji is like, he ran off to the Pokemon Tower to show up our foolishness. That was 2 weeks ago. He hasn't come back since. And then Mr. Fuji continues. He's like, but then in recent times, no one who enters the tower ever comes out again. And we go to the next frame, and it looks like Red is just outside in the rain again, just thinking. So Blue is missing? The guy's personality could use some improvement, but as a Pokemon trainer, he's the real thing. He doesn't go down easily. So what could put him out of action for 2 weeks? Could it possibly be? Could that tower really be haunted by ghosts? And then we get a close-up frame of Red's face getting determined. Well, I'm not running away from a challenge that he took on. I'll find out the truth behind those ghosts. And he's off to the races, and he enters the Pokemon Tower. He opens the door, and the door gives a creepy and Red is in. And he's just walking around. He sees all the tombstone of the past Pokemon, or the Pokemon that have passed. And then we hear bloop, and Red falls on his butt. He's like, "Phooey! Oh, just water dripping. Gotta get a grip." But man, this place didn't look so huge from the outside. Well, where's the other? And he's like, here's a hey, what's with this fog? And the place starts filling up with a whole bunch of fog. And he sees something in the distance, and he's like, huh? And then it's an outline of a Psyduck. A weird looking Psyduck. And Red's like, is that a Pokemon? And then all of a sudden, we have a whole bunch of Pokemon pop up around him. We have a Lickitung. We have a Slowpoke. We have a Tangela. He's like, more of them? And then Psyduck just starts swooshing towards him. And as soon as he gets close to Red's face, his eyes go away, and he just becomes a skull of himself with teeth underneath its beak. And then it's like, a very, very scary frame. And Red's like, oh my gosh, a ghost. And then from there, Psyduck turns from a regular Psyduck to just all bones with sharp teeth. And he sends out Bulbasaur. He's like, Bulbasaur, Razor Leaf, now! And then Bulbasaur's Razor Leaf goes and hits Psyduck straight in the head. But it does nothing because it's just all bones. And Red's like, nothing? We gotta stop these things, Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur, sleep powder! And Bulbasaur starts to use its sleep powder. It sends a seed right up into the air that will explode. And Red's like, this should do it. And then all of a sudden, he's like, no, it didn't even slow him down. All the Pokemon are creeping in towards Red again. And Red's like, they're ghosts. Nothing has any effect. What am I going to do? And Psyduck just jumps right over at Red. And Red's like, ah! And he covers up. And Bulbasaur uses its vine to do Vine Whip. And then all of a sudden, it actually wraps around Psyduck. And Red's like, it's falling apart. And then in the next frame, we see the eye is oozing out of Psyduck's head, and the body of Psyduck is just falling all apart and crackling, and all the bones are just going snap. And then all of a sudden, Psyduck is on the ground. Just a bunch of flesh and bones. And Red walks over to it. He's like, it's just an empty shell. But what was making it move? And then he looks up and he's surrounded by hundreds of dead Pokemon. He's like, who's controlling these things? And then right behind him, we get a Slowbro walking up towards Red. And then behind him to his left, he looks over and there's a Lickitung like easing in on Red. And Red's like, trying to mystify me. Well, and all the Pokemon just start flying at him all at once. And Red's like, Bulbasaur, run for it. And then he goes, huh? And then he looks behind him again. He's like, they're not following me. And then he sees that the Lickitung and a Slowpoke are now walking towards each other. He's like, wait a second. None of them are leaving the fog. That must mean this purple haze is what's controlling those zombies. And we get an outline of an eerie face in the fog. And Red's like, all right, now that I know that. And then all of a sudden we see a flame in the middle of the fog, and it just comes flying right at Red. And Red's like, ah, fire! Could it be that? And then we look and we get a figure inside of the fog, and he's like, Blue? You're okay. I never thought I'd be glad to say that. Now let's... And then he just looks over, and Blue is just standing there. And then all of a sudden, a big rush of fire just swoops right into the room and right around everybody. And Red's like, what's the idea, you? And then he's like, huh? And Blue is just standing there. And then surrounded by all the ghost Pokemon. And then we get a shot of its left eye. And then another shot of Red just smiling, just mean. And then we get a full frame of Blue looking like he's possessed with his Charmeleon. And his Charmeleon is also possessed. And Red's like, Blue, what happened to you? And that is it. That is how we end chapter 13, everybody. We have one more chapter to go, and it really seems like things are starting to heat up towards the end of volume 1 because Blue has been possessed. It looks like Charmeleon is attacking Red, and Red needs to figure out what he needs to do. So, other than that, it's that time, everybody, for all the plugs in this week's episode. Make sure you follow us at PokeBreakdown on Twitter. At this point, if you are listening to this episode on the free feed, the entire first volume and part of the second volume is already out there for you to listen to on the Patreon. Go ahead and go on patreon.com/everypokemon and subscribe to one of our many tiers that we have. We have a manga only section for only $5, everybody. If you want to listen to only the manga, or for just a little bit more, you can get the Pokemon episodes that I do with Doug, our main weekly podcast, along with the movies. So make sure you go on Patreon and you go and subscribe. But other than that, everybody, I want to thank you for downloading this episode. I hope you guys are really enjoying these Pokemon Adventure shorts. And we will end up getting together next week for another brand new episode of the Pokemon Adventures podcast, a short from the Every Pokemon Episode Ever podcast that I do with good old Dougie Fresh. My name is Professor Chris G, and I am signing out, and I will see you again next week, everybody. Have a good night.